Hey everyone, Liam here. So today we're going to do the sword on the line. I'm going to show you the process that I moved to get used to get the effect you can see on screen. If the video is helpful, please like and subscribe. Feel free to share. The channel's really young, so it would be really helpful at the moment. If you want to support me, you can check out my Patreon, which has all of my tuition options on there, both online and in person. Or if you want anything commissioned, feel free to get in touch through my Instagram or Facebook. Or if you just want to support the channel, then you can make a donation through the Patreon page. So I hope it's helpful. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Thanks a lot. Right, so first up, I've base coated the sword with P3 coal black, because I don't want black, because as I've said before, once you go black, it's too dark, you can't go any further, so it limits your options. On the wet palette, I have bottom 3 P3 coal black, and then I have a white and a black, and basically I'm mixing greys with the black and white, and I'm using the P3 coal black to tint those greys with a bit of blue. So you can see that going for quite a pale blue grey here. And you can also see that I've got the sword on the model. The reason why the sword is on the model is so I know where my light position on the sword should be in comparison to the model itself. So my light sources make sense across the model. So in this case, towards the top of the sword is going to be brighter, and also the left hand side of that sword is going to be brighter as well. The left hand side of the blade is going to be brighter. So all I'm doing at the moment is I'm just laying on the colour, the pale blue that I've mixed up, and I'm just putting it in the points where I want to be brighter, because that way I can take the sword off of the model once those light points are in place. I can take the sword off the model and then I can work with it easier. So now the sword's off the model, you can see that I'm going to be able to get to that sword a lot easier. The rest of the model isn't going to get in the way of my brush stroke. So on the wet palette, I'm adding more white to this blue grey tone that I've got. So I've got 3 or 4 different tones of grey effectively here. And the whole point of that is so I can jump between the different levels of brightness when painting this sword. Now, what's really important with this is we're going to go for like a brush steel effect. So I want like a lined texture in the sword. So when you're painting this, make sure you've got a nice tip on your brush. You could see a minute ago when I rubbed my brush on my thumb, that's to make sure that you get a nice mark, you get a nice point on your brush, so you get a very precise brush stroke. And as you can see on screen, it's quite clear, I'm just painting with lines. I'm just building up lines in the places that I want my highlight, or where I want the brightest shine. You're also going to see that I can't explain why I'm choosing where I'm putting these lines. It's very much a process of experimenting and understanding, and you're going to see like the actual process that I show you to do this, I end up changing the sword afterwards anyway, and I'm going to show you how it's changed, and I'm going to explain to you why I changed it. But you can see what I'm doing here. At the moment I've got a larger highlight towards the top of the sword, and I'm building up a secondary highlight towards the bottom. You can also see the large highlight along the top is actually broken. So there's darker sections in that highlight, and the reason being is because metals behave in really funny ways, and they get all sorts of reflections. So this is going to be quite a shiny sword, so you get all sorts of reflections and patterns in the sword, in the material, in the metal. We want to kind of try and replicate that, and we're also going to go really bright with this sword. I want the sword to be really quite bright. But yeah, so you can see I'm just doing the lines. I'm not worrying about blending. This is really important. The blending will come. The more layers that you build up, the softer the transition will get. It will just build up itself. The paint consistency I'm using is probably 1 part paint to 2 part water. So it's quite thin, but I still want to leave a hard mark at the moment, because I'm still... Remember, I always paint like this. I sketch out what I want to do first, and then I'll refine it later, because the problem is if you refine it all straight away and you don't like it, you're going to end up having to fix what you've done, or go over what you've done more importantly, And then you're going to have wasted so much time getting these beautiful smooth transitions and blends. So you can see you can clearly see where I'm going to have my highlights at the moment, where the reflection points, the bright points on this sword are going to be. Now, I know a lot of people say with non-metal metallics that you should go from black to white, you should have extreme contrast. I do disagree with that. It's good as a general rule when you're starting out, but I think it's more important for you to be looking at reference material and trying to work it out, because not all metals go from black to white. So a good point here as well is you can see that I'm edge highlighting. The reason why I'm edge highlighting here is because it gives me a very early indication of how this is going to look. Because metals, you need, if you're painting a metallic surface, you need to edge highlight. Metallic surfaces catch edges quite a lot. And the problem with painting like this as well is it's very hard early on in the process to see whether you're getting a nice result, because especially with non-metal metallics, is you never really, it always looks really odd until right at the end. It's normally those finishing touches where you go, where you see the metallic finish. So here, as you can see, the paint that I'm putting down now is darker than the last. So all I've done is where I've had those 3 or 4 mixes of the different greys, I'm now jumping back to a darker one, and I'm picking out the parts of the blade that maybe I want a little bit darker. Now, because you're using thin paint, you're not leaving physical marks on the model, you can just keep going over this and adjusting it, and you're going to see me later on when I finish it, and then when I finish the process on camera, and then I'm going to show you what's actually finished on the model, you're going to see that I end up repainting half of it anyway, and that's all because I'm using thin layers of paint. So all you're doing at this stage, sketch out your light placement, how dark you want it, how light you want it, and gradually build up those thin layers. And what you'll find as well is as you gradually build up those thin layers and play with your light placements, actually it's going to soften that transition anyway. You could already see a lot of my really hard marks from previous have disappeared. So next up, we're working with the brightest grey right now. So this is the grey where you've got the most white added to it, but we're not using white. We do not want to use white painting this sword. If you're putting white on the model at this point, you're far too bright, because once you're using white, you can't go any brighter, and you need that pure white paint to give you the shine later on. So this is a really pale grey. This is the palest grey that I have, the blue grey that I mix with the most white. Now, what I'm doing is my brightest points on the sword, I'm making brighter. I want to really mark out where my brightest points on this sword are going to be. And I'm also, as I'm going, I'm deleting any lines that I don't like, or more specifically, any of the darker lines. So you can see that I'm getting rid of a lot of blue here. It's because it's just a bit too much. Now when I'm doing this, I'm sure there's a lot of painters that plan this meticulously. I'm not like that. I quite like to go, right, this is where I want the brightest part of the sword. Now I'm just going to experiment, and I'm going to keep adjusting it until I get a result I like. There's no right or wrong way. It's how you want to do it, and you really need to, instead of listening to everyone online, just take on board what they say and then find your own way, because it's more important to understand your own process and understand how your paints and how your consistencies are going to behave, and find your own way, because there's no right or wrong way with painting. It's just your way and the way that works for you. So you can see here, I wasn't happy with the real dark coal black on the brightest side of the sword, so I'm basically getting rid of it. You can see I'm just working over it. So actually there's not a lot of contrast on this side of the blade at all now. When it comes to our spectrum of brightness, there's not a lot of dark in comparison. It's looking very flat right now. Remember, that's not a problem. So it's looking very flat right now, there's no doubt. But the reason why I'm not bothered about it looking flat is because the whole point of this is it's an adjustment stage. Most of this process is going to be you adjusting to make it look the way you want it. So you can see I'm going back in with a dark grey. I'm still using that grey mix, the blue-grey mix that I mixed on the wet palette at the beginning. Still just using those colours. We can add more colour later, but it's just a case of adjusting it how you like. I'm going to speed this up a little bit because there's no point me repeating the same things over and over, but you're going to see me just constantly making adjustments to my light placement on how the sword looks, and you can see as well that it's getting smoother as we go. Also, this one's going to be a bit of a long time lapse, so if you want to skip ahead and you don't want to watch me actually painting it all sped up, then skip ahead to 14 minutes 10 seconds into the video and you'll skip it all. But I would recommend it because you'll get to see actually how much I do make adjustments. So this is where we're at with the sword, just adding the edge highlights. Now you can see that actually it looks really smooth. There's no glazing happened on this sword yet. I've just built up those lines. You really see thin paint and just building up layers will get you a really nice result because it looks great already. So I do want to soften down the marks though. The lines are still a bit too hard for me. So I'm just going to mix up a bit of a glaze of different colours. So normally I do this in a well palette, but I was feeling a bit lazy. So you can see how thin that red is. This is the scale 75 deep red. Added probably 6 or 7 parts water. I'm going to do the same with the enchanted blue, which was on the top right of the wet palette as well. And all I'm doing is I'm using this to tint the sword. Now This paint here is actually too thin, because you can see I'm going over it. There's no such thing as too thin. All it'll do, the thinner you paint, the more layers you're going to have to build up. But this isn't going into a competition or anything like that, so I don't want to be doing stupid amounts of coats of thin paint. So I'm making the paint a little bit thicker, so it's got slightly less water in it now. And then I'm just picking out a couple of parts on the sword that I maybe just want some other colour in. Because this sort of metal is going to reflect all sorts of different surfaces. It can reflect anything around the character. So having some different colours is really helpful. Now I'm going to point out, so my big mistake here is when it comes to the actual colour, not the reflections on the sword, because there's a lot of problems with the sword itself at this stage that I'm not happy with. But my colour that I'm glazing in here, the red, it's too big. The parts of the sword that I'm tinting with red is just too large, so it doesn't look natural. And part of me kind of thinks that it would have been better to have maybe a harder finish as opposed to a softer transition out, but that's something to experiment with. And the other issue that I'm having here, so this is the enchanted blue. Now I think I do 3 glazes of this enchanted blue over the rest of the sword. Now I wanted to tone down the brightest parts of the sword, and that was successful, but the biggest problem is I put one too many layers of paint over it, and this sword goes far too blue and it looks very fantasy. It has a very fantasy finish on it, and I wasn't happy with that. So just by adding 1 layer too many, I'm going to be corrected now, it's going to be more than 3, but just by adding 1 or 2 layers too many to tint this sword, it's completely ruined the result that I want. It's not a bad result, but it's not the result I wanted. So you need to be very careful and don't glaze over too much with colours, because you can really alter what you've done. So I think this is the big one where it changes the tone of that sword completely. It almost turns to a complete blue as opposed to a really desaturated blue. And that was a mistake on my part. I shouldn't have done it that much, but you live and learn, and we can correct it. The way you're going to correct it is we're going to go back to those acrylic mixes of the pale blue that we had mixed previously, and we're just going to build up the highlights a little bit more. The second mistake that I made, which I think is here, I get the P3 Coal Black, I get Games Workshop Rhinox Hide as a glaze, and I glaze it into the shadows of this sword. So for example, that black section here and towards the bottom. But what I underestimated was just how dark Rhinox Hide is. And where those black sections on screen, they were actually coal black, so they weren't black. But this Rhinox Hide, you can see it here, it just darkens it so drastically. And I wasn't expecting that. So, and it looks really out of place now. So it had a huge impact on this sword. And now the shadows are just far too dark. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't look right to my eyes. So you just need to be really careful, and this is where experimenting comes in and not being afraid to make mistakes, because that Rhinox Hide especially was a huge mistake. I'm going to have to fix a lot of that now. So what we're going to do next is we need to desaturate this blade. It's far too blue at the moment. The blue is too vibrant. So I'm going back to exactly the same paints we were using before, the pale blue grey mix that we mixed up with the black and the white and the P3 Coal Black. And all I'm doing is, once again, those brightest points, I'm painting in those lines. I'm using the paint is a bit thinner this time. It's probably 3 parts water to 1 part paint. And the reason for that is I want a much softer mark, because I don't want to have to glaze over them all over again. I just want a nice soft mark this time. I'm still doing my brush stroke in the same direction, so I'm still following those lines that I've been doing for the whole of the blade. And that's really important because it maintains that almost texture, that brushed steel texture, which is what I've been doing the whole way through. So we want to maintain that. But all I'm doing is I'm slowly building up these highlights. I'm building up shine points on the sword, and that's desaturating the blue that we've got on the blade, because for me it's too blue at the moment. And it's also, once again, bringing those brighter points on the sword to a point where it looks shiny. So you can really see the sword blade right now is looking quite nice actually. You can see it's got the nice red tint along the bottom. The blade is no longer as blue as it was, but there's still a few things that I'm not really happy with, but we're going to get towards that towards the end. But you can see as well, what's really important is that shine points on this blade, I'm getting smaller and smaller the brighter I get with the colour now. And actually, the smaller your bright point, the smaller your reflection point, the smaller your highlight, the shinier it is going to look. And another important thing to remember, said it at the beginning, non-metallic weapons or non-metallic painting really need that edge highlight. So make sure you add the edge highlight around what you're painting. You can see here as well, I'm going over the other side of the sword right now. So this is an off-white, and I've got really thin paint, and I'm just going over the other side of the sword, the darker side of the sword. Now, it is a bit too large. I end up correcting it so they're not as big. But the point of this is when it's almost like a glint of light on the sword. So where this glint is, what you're going to do is you're going to put a dot of white in the center of it, and it gives quite a nice shiny result. And there you can see what I was going for. Now there is a problem with this, is because I've put two of them on there. They're both the same brightness, so it looks a bit weird, to be honest with you. The top one is my brightest point, so that one should be brighter than the one below it. And I think that's why this isn't making sense to me. When I look at it, the reflection on this sword doesn't make sense to me at this point. So although it looks nice, it definitely looks shiny, it definitely looks like a sword, there are a lot of small issues which are not helpful to me. They're not making sense. And I think, remember, we talk about readability a lot in these videos. You need to be able to look at something and clearly it needs to make sense. You need to be able to look at something and go, oh, that's leather, that's a sword, that's a metallic surface, that's a porcelain surface, or that's a skin tone, that's a flesh tone. You need to be able to look at something straight away, and that surface, that shape, that shouldn't confuse you in any way. And that's an issue that we're having with this sword at this point. Although the process that we've used is fine, the result that we're getting is fine, there's still something just looks off. And a big part of miniature painting is being able to diagnose, work out what it is that's not making sense. Right, so we're just going to go over the two swords. So the sword on the left is the sword that I've just showed you the process for, and the sword on the right is after I made adjustments off camera. Now, let me explain to you why I wasn't happy with the sword on the left. Don't get me wrong, it looks nice. I quite like the result, but it just wasn't what I wanted. So the first problem that I had was the left hand side of the blade, the left hand top, that light source on that blade, there was too much shadow in the middle of those two reflection points. And also those two reflection points are exactly the same brightness, and that was throwing me off completely. So I wasn't happy with that. That needed to be far more, it was too separate. It needed to be more uniform. So the other thing that was throwing me off is this dark shadow on the left hand side of the blade right in the middle. It's really dark and really red. And I think a combination of those three things, just, it wasn't making sense. So I adjusted all of them. I made that whole section of the blade, and you can see it in comparison to the finished blade on the right. I made that whole section of the blade much brighter and much more uniform. So there's not a huge amount of contrast in those sections of the blade anymore. And I think that made it much more believable, much more realistic. And what I would say about realism is be very careful about wanting something to be realistic, because of the scale that you're painting at, it's always interpretation of realism. It's always your interpretation. So you're never going to get a perfectly realistic result. So you just need to be happy with it. If you painted the sword exactly like this and you're happy with it, then that is the correct result. Don't let anyone tell you that your result is wrong. If you're happy with a result, regardless of what it looks like, that is the correct result. Never forget that. It's really important. It's just, for me, I wasn't happy with the result, so I wanted to change it. And you need to be afraid. You need to not be afraid to make mistakes. Learn from them, more importantly, because that's how you're going to improve. And then just change them. It's only paint. So the other part of this sword that was bugging me, the right hand side of the sword. The right hand side of the sword is just looks horrible to my eyes. The reason for this is the highlights, the shine points are just far too small. They don't make any sense to me whatsoever. This blade is still a flat surface, and the angle that it's held at is not an extreme angle. So the first issue is those highlight points are just far too wide, far too narrow, and they're too bright as well. Well, they're not too bright. The problem is the shadows are too dark. The darkest parts of this sword is black on the right hand side, and that just doesn't make sense to me either. So you can see when I've corrected this sword, or rather when I've changed this sword to what I want, to what I think is correct, I've changed it to one much larger highlight. It's much wider. Now it's important to note you still have variation in tone and in brightness. If you look at the sword on the right and the right hand side of that sword, it's not all just one level of brightness. There's still variation in it, but that variation is much more subtle. And the other thing to notice is the brightest point on the right hand side of the sword on the new version, on the right hand side of your screen right now, the brightest point of the right hand side of that sword is not as bright as the brightest point on the left hand side of the sword. So you have two completely different light situations, and that alone makes it more interesting. Now, to be honest with you, going back, I probably would have moved that highlight down a little bit further on the sword as well, but it's acceptable as it is. I'm happy with the way it turned out. But anyway, so that's the process for the sword. That's the adjustments that I made afterwards, and more importantly, the reasons why I made them. Let me know if you agree or disagree. It's always an interesting subject, but just remember, experiment, don't be afraid to fail. This sword was a really cool learning point for me. I learned a lot from it, all because of the mistakes I made. So yeah, hope the video was helpful. As always, let me know what you think.